Well, as I expected, the floodgates really opened this month. There was some tweet congratulating every musician for releasing music on the 25th, and considering how much of this episode comes from that single day, yeah, that hardly feels like an exaggeration. Fortunately, the influx of albums did end up reigniting a passion for music that had been kind of missing for me for a good long while. There have been great albums here and there this year, but the aggregation of quality in just a single day was something that really made me happy. Anyways, let's get to it. Here's some quick thoughts and ratings on new releases. This is Albumpressions. Panzerballett are one of those bands where you either already know what you're getting into, or you'll be taken off guard by them before figuring out their tricks pretty quickly. That is to say, they're very much a style over substance kind of band. Instrumental jazz metal and leaning heavily on both sides of that. Crushing riffs mashed together with extended instrumental noodling and plenty of saxophone. And this album sure is a Panzerballett album. I get kinda miffed whenever they do covers, just on the basis of my personal opinions towards covers. Fine on their own, but they don't belong on albums. I'd rather hear original material. But okay, I understand this is very much a jazz thing to do, and they transform the songs enough to be interesting anyways. And this is interesting. More chaotic and noisy here than what I've heard from them before for sure, but that ultimately leads to having less infectious grooves or notable melodies. I can put this on and enjoy it for what it is, and it's satisfying on a technical level for sure, but it's hardly going to stick with me. Worth checking out if you're unfamiliar with them though. Well, that band and album combo name sure is a mouthful. Anyways, a lot of the time albums are more likely to get me interested in listening to and talking about them if they're unique in some way or other, and yeah, this definitely qualifies. It's basically a very orchestral style of post-rock with some spoken word and screamed vocals providing the meat of the content, which, I'm in a bit of a tricky place, as I think I'd like this more without the vocals, but then I probably wouldn't have checked it out if they hadn't been there and it was labeled as just post-rock, so... The vocals do build to having some passion on each of the tracks in the end, but on the other hand, there are bits that annoy me as well. I guess this is what Cursive would be like if they went more avant-garde and long form with their songwriting. It's got the cellos and the hardcore vocals at least. I think I find this interesting more than I actually enjoy it, admittedly, but it's a neat little oddity all the same.
What have you done with my...
The Reticent's previous album was one so obviously good that I bought it before I'd even finished listening to it for the first time. And this album is also pretty obviously good, albeit maybe not quite as good. A concept album about a man suffering from Alzheimer's, with brief dialogue bookending each track to tie the story together, and that untitled final track looming ominously over it all. As for the music, well, it's easily classified as prog metal, and in particular they take a lot of influence from Opeth, maybe even a bit too much. But there's enough variety from track to track, and the album has plenty of ideas of its own anyways, with elements of death, doom, and black metal, alongside some symphonic touches and calmer moments in between. It's a bit all over the place, but all pretty solidly put together. I wouldn't say this album has any one track as powerful as Funeral for a Firefly, but the overall emotional arc of terror and despair certainly comes through in the music, and while I do have my nitpicks here and there, they hardly matter in the grand scheme of how appealing this is to me. The Ocean are one of those long-running bands that have way too much history for me to even really begin to go into here. But long story short, they play a progressive-leaning style of post-metal, and they have some really damn great work under their belt. This one's a follow-up to their album from 2 years back, and it's pretty much just a direct continuation of that sound, for better and worse. Their albums usually are growers for me, so take all of this with a grain of salt, but this feels kind of inessential by their standards. It's definitely not as conceptually exciting or diverse compared to what I know they're capable of. Mostly mid-tempo riffing with not a ton of emotional peaks, and only rare blasts of intensity or up-tempo moments. And there's a strangely alt-metal vibe to the sound. A new Deftones album just dropped too, and you'd be forgiven for mistaking songs from this for songs off that. It's also weirdly front-loaded, with the two longest tracks right at the start. Fundamentally it all sounds good, but it doesn't even feel like it had the highs that their previous, admittedly also kind of underwhelming, release had. We'll see. For as much as Sufjan can have individual songs that really resonate with me, it wasn't until his 2017 collab album Planetarium that I really clicked with one of his full projects. That album is disgustingly underrated and genuinely beautiful. Don't at me. So if he wants to continue pursuing similar sounds on his next big solo release, I'm honestly all for that. Sufjan the indie folk darling? Sufjan the indie-tronica artist? Sign me the hell up. Admittedly, there was no way this album could live up to the conceptual grandness and scope of Planetarium, despite its longer runtime. time. It does kind of feel like an album of Sufjan's contributions to Planetarium without the contributions of the other artists to an extent. A focus on electronic percussion and synths, with reduced emphasis on guitars or orchestra, but it does have a harsher, more industrial vibe to it overall that does enough to differentiate it. And admittedly it runs a bit long, though few albums really need to be 80 minutes or longer, honestly. Still, there's a lot of exciting stuff here, and the overall package feels strong and cohesive too. Definitely one I'll be coming back to. You know, black metal and hardcore have such natural synergy that it's surprising we don't get more black and hardcore releases. I mean, they're not unheard of either, but both genres are based in raw intensity with shrieking vocals and, ideally, a strong emotional core. And that's exactly what Svalbard delivers here, just a great balance of the two genre streams, resulting in a record that's harrowing and vicious, bordering on overwhelming, and adding a lyrical throughline that's essentially just an evisceration of rape culture and, God, yes! It's so damn satisfying. And that's only given an extra layer of impact by the band leaving the record label due to sexual assault allegations against the label's owner, a coincidence which can only be described as unfortunately perfect. There isn't a weak moment here, and the sound, at its core, is inherently compelling enough to have me sold on the project regardless of the content, but that extra layer of righteous anger just pushes it over the top for me. Not really much else to say on this one. It's pretty straightforward in what it wants to be, and it just executes on it really damn well. Honestly, going into this I had zero expectations. Their debut was excellent, but their 2016 follow-up, to put it bluntly, was tedious and boring. Haven't gone back to revisit it much at all. And then the singles from this one were playing into a sludge metal direction that wasn't really doing anything for me either, so didn't have high hopes for this, no. In that context, this definitely exceeded my expectations. It's actually fairly diverse and interesting, and even the songs I wasn't so hot for on their own work a lot better in the context of the album. Mostly I'm just glad it's not as dull as their last one though. It's hard to classify. They do pull a lot from sludge metal and prog metal in general, but there's a lot of different styles matched up in this meat grinder. I'm still not too into the aesthetic of this album, and I still don't think this style of harsh vocals fully works for me either, but I did find this to be plenty enjoyable, albeit not at the level of their debut. We'll see if it grows on me. Ayreon is the long-running musical project of one Arjen Lucassen, each album pulling together a collective of vocalists to make a big, large prog metal rock opera. And more he's been sliding towards making musicals rather than albums, which I just find a lot less compelling. I haven't heard a single great new Ayreon track since 01011001, and the trend towards less song-focused albums starting in 2013 feels almost entirely to blame for that. The music itself is probably the least interesting thing to talk about here. It's very standard Ayreon fare, not as diverse as it usually is, and not really fresh either, but not unenjoyable. As for the plot, the narration feels really intrusive and suggests an inability to fill in the narrative gaps through lyrics alone, which is weird considering there are also plenty of moments in the story that feel completely pointless and only seem to exist to give singers Arjen had already hired something to do. It's not compelling, it feels pretty generic, and it ends unsatisfyingly to boot. I don't know, I didn't have super high expectations going into this one, and it's ultimately fine, but it's nothing special, which feels weird and wrong for an Ayreon project. When browsing new releases and seeing the metalcore tag, I always feel like I'm playing a game of chance where sometimes the album is actually metalcore, or sometimes it's just gent. This time I won the coin flip, thankfully. I mostly want to use this segment to talk about what I think makes a good metalcore album because, well, this album is a good metalcore album. Not comparable to Svalbard, of course, but it doesn't give me much to talk about by itself. For one, again, not being gent helps. The vocals do have that core sound to them, but there's a noticeable passion behind them and dynamic delivery in the screams rather than feeling like obligatory metalcore vocals. They pair well with the heavy but still distinguishable and melodic riffs and leads backing them up, and there's plenty of intensity, but it's not completely relentless, just diverse enough, with a good guitar sound and a balanced mix. It's not just mindless heaviness and anger, I guess is what I'm getting at. It does run a bit short and doesn't feel particularly fresh, but I could see it growing on me a lot all the same. The only genres I feel can really get away with sub 30-minute albums are metalcore and its subgenres, or adjacent genres like screamo, mathcore, etc. And with albums as dense and relentless as this one, yeah, I really can't imagine this working as a full 40-minute album anyways. Zeit fell pretty squarely under mathcore, playing a variety just melodic enough to not feel like an incomprehensible, pointless wall of sound, but still pretty damn unrelenting and colorful the whole way through, with only a short break in the middle to let the listener catch their breath for just a moment. And I'll freely admit this is more intrigue than enjoyment for me. I don't know if this is an now I might be able to stomach giving a bunch more listens to, but it does have firepower and manic energy that makes it unquestionably interesting. Might be missing a bit of emotional resonance for me. It's intense, but it's not much else. But I find it fascinating all the same. Definitely at least worth a few more spins. You know, first off, I just want to take a moment to appreciate Voidhanger Records. They have a history of signing and promoting a wide variety of obscure underground metal acts, especially black metal acts, and I've yet to see anything from them that even smells of NSBM stink at all. Even if I don't enjoy everything released under their banner, they're more often than not at least interesting, especially the weird, avant-garde, metal adjacent acts. That Neptunian Maximalism album that blew up a few months ago? Yep, signed to Voidhanger. And this album, too, is one of those not really metal, hard to describe albums. It's tagged as dark occult funk for starters, an amusing label for sure, but weirdly accurate. A big chunk of this album is bass grooves, a bunch of pretty strong ones, with drums backing them up and woodwinds and black metal leaning vocals to provide that occult atmosphere. It's definitely interesting, albeit it does run the risk of the novelty wearing off quickly, and it's a pretty short release to boot, though in the same breath, I'm not sure it's diverse enough to warrant a long runtime anyways. I don't know, mostly I just think it's neat.
Before man came, a secret time before time.
Enslaved are a band older than I am. I think that's the short way of saying I'm not even going to bother getting into their history here, especially since I've never even listened to any of their first decade's worth of albums. They have a lot of them, and they've been going through a long transformation to more and more of a progressive metal band first, black metal band second, for which I can't really complain. This most recent album is actually their first that feels like a bit of a step back from more progressive territories since, Axioma in 2010? Though those elements are still present here. Shorter and more focused songwriting and a lot more straightforward aggression dominate the album though. As for how it sounds besides, well, it's an Enslaved album. If you weren't a fan before, this probably won't change your mind, but take it for what it is and you'll have a pretty enjoyable time. I'm not sure it'll stand out all that much in their massive catalog, and I'll definitely need time to see how it grows on me, but I'd be hard pressed to say I found it disappointing either. So, the solo project of the former The Dillinger Escape Plan frontman, eh? Not that I was ever a big fan of them to begin with, nor do these kind of solo projects from members of metal bands all necessarily turn out great, but I have always liked Puciato's vocals, especially his cleans, and this stylistically is very different from his former band too, so I figured I may as well give it a shot, and it's pretty neat. I'd be hard pressed to say I found it immediately all that impressive, and it does run a bit long too, but I enjoy the variety of sounds on display here, ranging from gothic synth pop to heavy alt metal, though notably very few instances of anything resembling the mathcore chaos of the Dillinger Escape Plan at their loudest, which, again, I'm fine with. And Puciato remains a compelling and diverse vocalist here, slotting into the poppier moments just as easily as the heavier moments. Nothing that blew me away, but I definitely returned to it. Bit of a shame about that album title, though. It's, kind of embarrassing to even read. This album is an interesting, well, I'd struggle to say oddity, as it really isn't all that unusual or weird, but it's doing more than it would initially let on. The first few tracks fall pretty cleanly in a progressive leading stoner and sludge metal sound, think Mastodon or Veritas, which probably explains the band's name, come to think of it. But a few tracks in, they pick up some blackened edges that recur a few times throughout the rest of the album, and the post-metal undertone creeps in with some of the longer, more patient tracks in the back half as well. Basically, they're doing a lot, and while none of what they're doing on the surface comes off as that unique, it's all competent for what it's trying to be, and it remains compelling and diverse the whole way through. Mostly it just seems to be lacking for any really exceptional moments, but they may show themselves on future listen, who knows. Definitely at least worth checking out if you're curious. I actually went back and checked out this band's previous two albums, then gave this another spin because, heck it, they're all pretty short, and this is a band I'm surprised I hadn't checked out yet anyways. And I gotta say, Stage 4 seems pretty great actually. This new one, well, I like it, but it's not clicking in quite the same way. Mostly I think that it's just that it lacks a strong thematic arc. The content here is relatable, but it's scattershot and there isn't really much tying it together until the very end. As for their sound in general, I think they have a pretty colorful and often warm hardcore screamo sound that I definitely find appealing, but I just cannot for the life of me get into the style of harsh screams. I don't know, they sound painful in the wrong way. Like, producing that sound has to hurt, right? Maybe I'll warm up to them like I did for Loud Dispute? We'll see. This is definitely a band I want to dive deeper into, and an album I might get out of curiosity, but I also might just skip back to Stage 4 instead. And that'll round us out for this month. Yeah, pretty much all the releases aggregated around one day, and frankly all the best music this month came out on that day too, so I'm not too inclined to complain. I think things will really be slowing down as we approach the end of the year, though there's still a few releases coming up that I'm looking forward to, albeit not much of that seems especially exciting, but we'll see. Until then, Cyro signing off. See y'all next month.